my expectations when I went north were really that wilderness was, I went with some pretty romantic ideas of the wilderness, right? That it was a thing out there. It's the place that doesn't have any people in it. These are all incredibly colonial ideas, I realized pretty fast. And then, in fact, the wilderness that I was in has been inhabited for an incredibly long time. It is very, very well known. And is also a place where the Gwich'in, who are the people that I were living with, have figured out ways of being within it that take into account the fact that the place itself is sort of a constant formal force in people's lives, right? From what the weather is doing to what the bears are up to kind of all the variables in between. And just in my day-to-day life, not paying attention to those things was impossible, right? It was silly. It was potentially deadly. So I think at kind of just the practical nature of living in the Arctic meant that you start to pay attention to the ways in which being a person is always something that's conditioned by the world around you in a way that's a little easier to ignore if you're in a temperate place with lots of kind of technological padding around you.
Right.
And then sort of as I went further in my education, I started to think about why it was I could even have imagined this separation, right? And that it's a really kind of well-policed separation, in fact, for many people. And then, it really does structure the way that we educate young people and kind of interact with the world as a society. So it's hard to avoid in many ways.
Good day, I'm Mark Good, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Just the Facts. Our podcast is sponsored by Fact Ohio, which is the faith communities together for a sustainable future. Today, our featured guest is Dr. Bathsheba Demuth, the Dean's Associate Professor of History, Environment, and Society at Brown University in Rhode Island. Dr. Demuth is also the author of Floating Coast, an Environmental History of the Bering Strait. Now, interviewing Dr. Demuth today on our show is FACT's own Dr. Ted Auck. Dr. Auck is the professor of global biogeochemistry and soil science at Cleveland State University and the Great Lakes Program Coordinator at the Frac Tracker Alliance. Dr. Auck?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm on the Faith Communities for a Sustainable Future, or FACT, board. I've been on this environmental nonprofit board here in Ohio for 6 years now, serving as the vice chair of the board. I also work on energy impacts in my role at a nonprofit called the Frac Tracker Alliance. And I think that this is what we're doing here is we are having a companion piece to our lecture series, and Bathsheba was kind enough to offer to come speak with us. So that's what we're going to be doing here is we're going to expand on some of the concepts that she got at in her book, The Floating Coast, and then maybe some other stuff. So, yeah.
Excellent, Ted. Thanks for the background. Dr. Demuth, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Bathsheba Demuth, and I'm an associate professor at Brown University. I'm trained as an environmental historian, so what I do is study the relationship between people and the places that they live and how they change each other in the past. That's the thumbnail sketch. I'm originally from Iowa, but now live in Providence, Rhode Island, when I'm not up north, which is really where my heart is.
And when you say north, I guess that's north of the Arctic Circle.
Yes, very north. The more north, the better.
I can see that. Well, tell us, Bathsheba, what got you interested in that part of the world? I mean, north of the Arctic Circle is way north. What brought you there?
So I ended up interested in the North, partly as a extension, I think, of reading too much Jack London as a kid. But kind of more practically, I went north originally because I didn't know what I wanted to study in college. I felt like I should go to college, but didn't have a clear path, and it's pretty expensive and takes a bunch of time, or it feels like a lot of time when you're 18 to go do something for 4 years. So I convinced my parents to let me sort of put together this shoestring budget round the world trip. I was really interested in writing and photography, so I wanted some experiences outside of Iowa. And the first place on my list was this village called Old Crow, which is in the Canadian Arctic. I didn't know anything about that part of the world. My job was to train sled dogs in this little native village. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, a thing about which I knew nothing. I had some ideas, but they were all wrong. And I got totally hooked. The around the world part of my plan went right out the window, and I ended up staying there for several years. And that's really kind of what kicked off my lifelong interest in this part of the world.
So did that sort of influence or drive your education experience then after that? I mean, did you say, gee, I want to learn more?
Basically, I mean, it's easy to interpret these things in hindsight as one thing neatly leading to the other, when in fact there's always a little bit more going on. But I think that my interest in the ways in which people choose to live in the places they call home really started with that experience up north. And my interest in the ways that different kind of colonial ideas have come to inhabit the far north was very much spurred by that initial experience. And it's something that I studied in undergrad. And then when I finished my undergraduate education, my husband and I did the Peace Corps in the former Soviet Union. And it was actually kind of living in the kind of remnants of this communist attempt to change a society that made me interested in both the Russian and US parts of the Arctic that come through in this book. Because I saw some similarities to what I had seen in Canada, this kind of desire to transform a part of the world that operates very differently from temperate places. And at the same time, something that looked very different, because the kind of material reality on the ground and the ideology behind it are, of course, not the same as what is happening in Alaska or Canada.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, I know you've written a book, and Ted, you've prepared some questions that are sort of driven by that. Let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, it's such a fascinating book. As someone who's really interested in energy and the colonial role that energy plays, not just in places like that, but even in like Appalachia, where I work a lot, it was this kind of whole concept of the colonial concept really drew me into your book. I don't even really know how I stumbled across it, but I'm so glad I did. I guess my first question for you is you start the book by talking about a kinship with the sandhill crane. And I, as someone who's a birder and a lover of cranes, and having just seen whooping cranes down in Texas, my memories flash back to me. And I was wondering, in the book, you talk about you having an education that explains nature's past separately from human history, from culture, economics, and politics. And I think, and you also talked about, and the fact that nature was a thing to be acted upon. And I'm thinking back to my college education, and even before that, I feel like we were all kind of educated in that way. And I'm kind of wondering how soon when you moved up to this beautiful place, how soon you were disabused of this notion, and what your studies have taught you about the holes in this type of thinking since then.
It's a good question. I think in some ways I was disabused very quickly, in that my expectations when I went north were really that wilderness was, I went with some pretty romantic ideas of the wilderness, right? That it was a thing out there. It's the place that doesn't have any people in it. These are all incredibly colonial ideas, I realized pretty fast. And then in fact, the wilderness that I was in has been inhabited for an incredibly long time. It is very, very well known. And is also a place where the Gwich'in, who are the people that I were living with, have figured out ways of being within it that take into account the fact that the place itself is sort of a constant formal force in people's lives, right? From what the weather is doing to what the bears are up to kind of all the variables in between. And just in my day-to-day life, not paying attention to those things was impossible, right? It was silly. It was potentially deadly. So I think at kind of just the practical nature of living in the Arctic meant that you start to pay attention to the ways in which being a person is always something that's conditioned by the world around you, in a way that's a little easier to ignore if you're in a temperate place with lots of kind of technological padding around you.
Right.
And then sort of as I went further in my education, I started to think about why it was I could even have imagined this separation, right? And that it's a really kind of well-policed separation, in fact, for many people. And then, it really does structure the way that we educate young people and kind of interact with the world as a society. So it's hard to avoid in many ways.
Yeah, no, I think back to I as part of my work, I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin doing some work looking at sand mining in western Wisconsin for the fracking industry, and I remember a friend of mine, member of the Ho Chunk tribe, Bill Greendeer, used to tell me when we'd go around and look at these sand mines, he said, I don't even. He was just not talking specifics, but just the view he had on these bluffs, these in western Wisconsin, and what he remembers about them, and the role they played in his life, and what's being done to them. It was like, it's just like you walk away from them, they're almost in tears thinking about like the difference between the way that I was looking at that environment and the way that he was in real time. So it's really a humbling experience, and sounds like that was humbling for you as well. So that's really really cool. I had another question that came up was thinking about the Bureau of Biological Survey. I was not one agency that I had really heard a lot about, and I'm thinking specifically about page 125. You talked about how they viewed the walruses as more of like a Boone and Crockett Club kind of thing, and I was struck by that because I read a lot about Teddy Roosevelt and bison and some of the views of some of the Eastern kind of white males on how to steward our ecosystems. And I'm wondering if you could kind of maybe expand on the role that this biological survey played in your book, but just in the overtaking of that side of the Bering Sea.
Right. So the Bureau of Biological Survey, which later gets folded into other kind of sections of the Department of the Interior, so things like the Fish and Wildlife Service later on, which is probably what you know it as today,
Right.
Kind of arrives in the Bering Strait having learned quite a bit about the sort of ecological destruction that kind of no holds barred colonial and economic expansion could play, right? So these are people who have been paying a lot of attention to the Great Plains, like Teddy Roosevelt, and are concerned that Alaska is sort of the last U.S. territory where this dynamic hasn't played out fully. And so they come in wanting to prevent that kind of real ecological degradation, which is in many ways an excellent goal, right? It's an important one, and it's one that underlies the creation of national parks and a lot of other legislation in the United States to protect wild spaces. Where their kind of understanding of how the Bering Strait ecosystem, and I think ecosystems in general, was really lacking, was in seeing the ways in which these animal species like walruses or like bison played really critical roles in the lives of indigenous peoples who had the knowledge and capacity, if given the political power, to manage those resources themselves, right? So it's a kind of coming in from outside and saying, oh dear, there's this kind of capitalist drive to hunt, which is being led by non-indigenous people. We need to shut that down. And at the same time, they end up shutting down kind of any and all hunting. And it's tied to the idea that, of course, that wilderness is a place where people don't go and don't touch, except maybe for sort of recreation. You can go there to be educated by its grandeur, or you can go there to hunt a trophy animal, but otherwise it's sort of a hands-off kind of conception of what wild spaces are, which has nothing to do, of course, with the understanding of these spaces by the people who have lived there for thousands of years.
Right. And kind of underneath that, the phrase carrying capacity came up in your book several times. And I'm fascinated by that concept because I think a lot about like ecological economics and ecosystem services and kind of the whole like predator prey relationships that you talk a lot about. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that concept of carrying capacity, because I'm not finding it in the book right now, but I do remember you talked about the different way in which Russia and the US looked at that phrase, and Russia, maybe you could go into that for us a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the place in the book where this idea came up, it comes up quite a bit in the sort of middle part of the 20th century when people are thinking about ecosystems. But the biggest contrast I saw was in the ways in which the United States and the Soviet Union think about reindeer, and domestic reindeer in particular. So both countries are really interested in domestic reindeer. They see them as a way of taking these tundra ecosystems, which generally speaking they saw as really lacking. They saw them as kind of insufficient because they are not easily agricultural. but reindeer kind of made them possibly agricultural. At least you could grow some sort of meat product on this land. And in the United States, this was very inflected by kind of capitalist ideas. And in the Soviet Union, it was done in a collective way. But the kind of core idea was to try to make the tundra maximally productive for human beings, right? To kind of serve human needs. In this case, through food, right? Make it able to feed people. And both the US and the Soviet Union start doing a lot of math, particularly in the early 20th century and on, about how many reindeer the tundra could carry, right? How many could it sort of support in perpetuity? If you get rid of all the wolves, if you manage all of the diseases, if you basically rid the tundra of anything that isn't a reindeer or a person taking care of the reindeer, sort of what's the maximum carrying capacity? And in the US, they toss around numbers that are in the millions. In the Soviet Union, which has a lot of tundra, if you start at the Bering Strait and go all the way over to the Atlantic, almost, they're talking in the tens of millions. But some of the Soviet planners are sort of so convinced that the kind of capacity of Marxism to overcome all ecological limits, that they argue that actually the carrying capacity is essentially infinite. That you can, Marxism, if properly kind of introduced, will let you always keep growing, which is, to me, just such a fascinating thought experiment, because you don't want infinite reindeer at some point. It would crowd out people. But the kind of strength of the idea that human beings were able to transform where they live to basically any degree that they want to was so embedded that some of these planners were able to kind of hypothesize in that direction.
Yeah, that was really, really interesting. I mean, I think also just your whole book, it's like we all think about this tension, the Cold War tension, and tension before that is like having to do with military, and now we're having with the Arctic, with the permanent ice in the Arctic potentially being gone by the time my kids are my age. Like there's a whole nother tension around, icebreakers and who has more and all this stuff. But it's like you don't even think back to the whole idea of like the movement of protein, as you kind of emphasize it in your book, around this area, and it's it's the boom bust cycles around it. We don't even think about it in that way. So it was like really, really fascinating. I was also thinking, you talk about a couple of animals specifically: Arctic fox. We talked about the walrus, the bowhead whale, caribou, and wolves. And I'm wondering, maybe one or two of those. Could you give us a little bit of a sense for your takeaway on one or two of those? Because I think it's really interesting that you organize your book around, or you weave in these species and the role that they play pre and post kind of contact.
Yeah, so this book did not initially start out being about animals or kind of having animals as the central figures, really. I thought it was going to be about two towns, one on the Russian side of the Strait and one on the US. And that sort of rapidly fell apart when I started doing the research. In large part because of whales, and because the sources I was reading and the oral histories I was reading and hearing, kind of everything was saying actually the real moment of kind of focused attention from Europeans and Americans starts with whaling in the 19th century. And I had really thought of this as kind of a late 19th, 20th century colonial story, one that really doesn't pick up until the Soviet Union is active in a lot of ways. I didn't think I was going to write about the Russian Empire at all. But then the sources just kept saying, well, it's whales. This is where it starts. So I started looking into whales. And that's actually where the whole kind of energy piece also came into focus, is that the reason that people were in the Bering Strait and killing whales in these numbers, outsiders, is because they wanted whale oil. And so it's really the first oil boom in the Arctic, long before petroleum. And then kind of gives way to these other kind of energy extraction missions to find walrus oil and find meat in caribou and these other kind of things that you could possibly extract. So I owe a lot to the whales, actually. They gave me this sort of whole way of seeing the region in some sense. And part of what was fascinating about thinking about this place through bowhead whales is that these are animals that they live for an extraordinary long time. So the oldest whales that we know of are 2 centuries old. So one of the whales I talk about was born, probably when Thomas Jefferson was president and died when Clinton was president. So they have this extraordinarily lifespan that actually covers kind of the whole arc of this book. And then kind of imagining the transformations that these animals have been witness to, and transformations that have kind of come into their lives pretty directly, both through capitalist whaling in the 19th century and then the kind of communist counterpoint that happens in the 20th century. Felt like a way to kind of reorient how we think of history as including these animals pretty directly. They became real actors and characters in the story, in a way that I didn't expect.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just like I think that was I remember when I first read your book, the most salient point for me that I walked away with, like, telling people about was, like, you never think of you're familiar with the concept of ecosystem engineers, but, like, you don't think about, everyone knows the story of Greenpeace and the whale decline and stuff, but you never think about these organisms as these huge movers of energy all over the world. And, like, when those populations peter out, like, what are the ripple effects of that? Like, we don't think about it in that way. So, like, when you described it as this, like, conveyor belt of energy moving up and down these, to the Bering Sea and back, it's like, it's just kind of amazing. And then you of course describe, maybe second only to the bison destruction in the Great Plains, the devastation that was wrought on these animals. And I'm wondering, to that end, you talked about a couple of things. One was the Convention on the Regulation of Whaling, Council for the Conservation of Whales, and the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling. And I'm wondering, those agencies, those organizations, or those efforts, what role did they play in whale populations? If you could speak on that a little.
Yeah, so those are all kind of 20th century attempts to regulate whaling. And one thing I learned during the research for this book that I didn't know is that the majority of whales that human beings have killed kind of by industrial means and for major commercial reasons happened in the 20th century. I always thought of it as sort of a 19th century Moby Dick story that kind of ended with the tall ships. But actually, this kind of large-scale industrial whaling is really, the force that removed the most whales from the ocean. It's about 2 to 3 million over the course of the 20th century. And these kind of series of conventions that start in the 30s and then really are formalized in 1948 with the International Whaling Commission are trying to kind of, from within the whaling industry itself, regulate it to keep it from killing its way out of existence. So it's an international organization. It has members from all the major whaling countries, plus the United States, basically because the United States is a big international player after the Second World War, not because the US is whaling at that point. And they get together every year to try to decide how many whales they can kill without kind of pushing species past the point of survivance. The problem being that this is a kind of voluntary group. There's no real penalty for leaving it. There's no real penalty for skirting around the edges of its prescribed numbers. And so there's a lot of pressure within the group to keep the quotas as high as possible, just to keep all the parties participating. So the kind of correspondence at the meetings, you can say these kind of agonized processes where biologists are saying, you need to stop killing all, say, fin whales in a particular part of the world because their populations are too low, and then they will kind of negotiate it up to a higher quota, just so that they don't have countries leave the convention entirely. So in some ways, it's a case study of how difficult it is for industries to police themselves, right? There were not exterior enforcement mechanisms from the general public or from, kind of any other body that wasn't directly interested in whales as a commodity to kind of come in and put direct pressure until the kind of the later 70s, when Greenpeace and some other environmental organizations start protesting whaling pretty directly. By that point, basically the only major whaling nations are the Soviet Union and Japan and to some extent Norway. The rest of Western Europe has kind of gotten out of the whaling business. Like the UK, which had been a major whaler, is no longer really whaling at that point. Denmark is out. Germany is out after the Second World War. So it's also a series of protests, in the U.S. against whaling when whaling is not an industry that's actually paying any bills. So in some ways, it's an easier environmental target from within the U.S. and Canada than some other environmental issues. But Greenpeace is very effective at kind of bringing the idea of industrial whaling to the general public in a way that I think is important in putting pressure on the Soviet Union to withdraw. It's not the only thing that's happening. There's pressure from within too, but that is kind of it's a moment where the IWC actually does have some pressure from outside to lower the quotas and eventually to stop industrial whaling altogether.
Right. Could you describe too, I mean, these are huge themes in your book. Could you describe a couple things, the role that disease, I guess maybe the word is vice, and also Christianity played in moving up into this region, I guess on the North American side? I'm specifically thinking about, the missionary work that comes up quite a bit in your book, the role that missionaries played in this whole thing. Because the takeaway I came from your book was this kind of like, this gospel, well, it's like this mixture of like, just capitalism, but also just Christianity and like trying to pivot these people's view on their natural surroundings into something to be consumed, to profiteered from. And just like your general sense on disease, vice, I'm thinking specifically of alcohol and Christianity up there.
Yeah, so this there's kind of this potent moment in northwestern Alaska and to some extent in far northeastern Russia in the 1860s through the early 20th century, where neither the U.S. nor Imperial Russia has a large role. Right, there's not a lot of government on the ground. There aren't regular patrols or police or judges, or that kind of apparatus is pretty scarce in both places. And so the people that are there are the indigenous folks, so the Inupiaq and the Yupik and the Chukchi, and then whalers who are coming in this kind of first tide of commercial whale hunting, and then missionaries. And the whalers, are sort of temporary presences for the most part. Some of them end up kind of marrying into communities and stay for a long time, but a lot of them come in for a summer season and whale and leave, and are interested while they're there in trading for all kinds of things, right? They're interested in trading for furs, and they're interested in trading for food, and they're interested in trading for sex. And so there's a kind of booming trade economy springs up around the Bering Strait, much of which the missionaries are pretty skeptical of. Missionaries and whalers often exist in tension all throughout the Pacific, because missionary ideas of kind of a good way to live a life is not highly itinerant. It's not separated from your family. It doesn't include working on Sundays, which whalers often did. It doesn't include drinking, which whalers often did. There's all sorts of, kind of cultural differences between missionaries and whalers. And so the missionaries come in some sense to save Native people, in the missionaries' terms, from the conditions of being outside Christianity, right? They want to save souls the way that all Christian missionaries do. And they also want to save indigenous peoples from whalers and from sort of bad influences that they see. So there's actually quite a lot of conflict that's pretty complicated on the ground, because missionaries may or may not get along with the whalers, and whalers may or may not need missionaries at certain times. And for the indigenous folks on the ground, like sort of watching the ways that these peoples interact with each other and disagree with each other, it can show up in the oral histories in ways that are really quite fascinating and interesting, because you get this sort of outsider perspective on, well, one kind of ambassador from this culture is telling me that these are the sort of very strict rules of living a good life, and the other ambassador, who speaks the same language, is telling me that I should sell him, a fox skin for this whiskey. So it has a really kind of interesting melting pot kind of effect on the ground, um, much to the consternation of the missionaries.
Yeah. The I'm looking at page 111 in your book, and there's a quote, and I'm not going to try to say this individual's name because I'm not going to say it correctly, but you quote hers excuse me. You quote her saying that she knew that animals judged their hunters. And then you talk a little bit on the next page about how these missionaries came in, and the passage here is the rite of the Eucharist for Berengia's missionaries was exclusive. To believe in Christ meant not believing walruses were once people. Holding the two ways of being together at once was impossible. So maybe I'd love to hear a little bit about like that tension, the tension between that, the rights of nature and the intimate relationship between the human and its surroundings, the people who live there, and that that seemingly different view on that relationship, I guess, by the missionaries. It sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, I would say that the majority of the 19th century and early 20th century missionary accounts that I read don't come in with a lot of sympathy or space to think of the indigenous worldviews and practices that they found on the ground as being legitimate, right? They are the impediment to the salvation of these peoples, right? These are ideas that have to be gotten rid of so that an Inupiaq person can become an American citizen and can become a saved soul. And often those two things are kind of conflated in ways that are complicated. Whereas obviously if you're coming from an indigenous culture, those beliefs are not things that you can just like get rid of and hand over, right? So the missionaries are coming in, they have kind of a quasi-federal role. They're initially paid by the US Education Department, so they're coming in kind of as part of an assimilationist project to kind of remove indigenous people from their cultures, not necessarily physically, but spiritually and economically and practically. And there are cases where you see missionaries who are completely on board with this goal, right? They see it as the only possible way forward for Native peoples. They want to eradicate all indigenous spiritual practices. They're willing to be incredibly strict and in some cases violent about it. And then there's occasionally a missionary who is actually really conflicted and doubtful, and you can see them wrestling with the idea that perhaps not at a spiritual level, but at least at a practical level, there is an acknowledgement that these indigenous communities have figured out how to live well in this place, in a place where missionaries often fail to live well. They don't have the skills, they don't have the tools, they don't know how to do it. And I think some missionaries go as far to say, these are communities that care for their children incredibly deeply, that look after each other, that are, kind of cohesive in ways that they were worried would be just sort of destroyed by outsiders coming in. So every now and then you get these kind of moments of self-critique from within this kind of assimilationist project.
And kind of a little bit of a aside from that thread is you talked about the 1902, I believe it was the Alaskan game law, John Lacey's 1902 Alaskan game law. That was also something I'd never heard of. Could you maybe give a sense for, and I actually looked it up a little bit, but maybe your perspective on that law and like what was its role?
So that 1902 law is kind of an extension of the sort of Teddy Roosevelt Wilderness Act era preservation movement that is really trying to mitigate and regulate the ways in which the kind of late 19th century boom and bust capitalism and colonial takeover of the Great Plains had sort of transformed American ecosystems. So it comes from a place of real concern on that front. And concern that in Alaska, this is just going to happen again, right? You're going to lose all the fur-bearing animals. You're going to lose all the big wildlife. So the 1902 game law puts pretty strict limits. And in many ways, the real target of that law are commercial walrus hunters. who had been coming in and killing thousands of walrus a season out on the sea ice. That hunt had already sort of started to decrease because the herd itself is decreasing, but they do not want the walruses to go the way of the bison. So it's it's trying to regulate commercial hunting. In the process, it initially ends up folding in indigenous hunting, also sort of subsistence focused, feeding your family type hunting, and kind of limits the numbers of walruses that native communities are allowed legally to hunt, and other animals too. So bears and some other species are lumped in there. And this causes, in some places, real hardship because outsiders don't necessarily know how many walruses it takes to feed a family through a winter. And this plays out basically everywhere I've ever seen a game law come in, is that there's a severe underestimation of how many caribou or how many reindeer or how many walruses it really takes to keep people going in a place where, the weather is incredibly cold. And this is your major food source, right? You're not also growing a patch of corn in your backyard because corn does not love the tundra. So often these kind of outside regulations are, they're responding to a problem, which is large-scale commercial hunting, and then they kind of grandfather in any hunting at all, and then they kind of underestimate what people need for subsistence.
Well, also, I mean, it seems too like, right, so that's interesting that they underestimate the amount of animals that they need, and it's kind of incredible when you think about the fact, I mean, this is something I try to teach my 9-year-old about, like, the interaction between indigenous people and bison and the interaction between Europeans as they went west and bison is like, they used everything, every single part of that animal. And I'm assuming that the same went for the walrus and some of these other animals, right? There was not a whole lot of waste with these animals, right?
No, not at all.
Right. I mean, the effort that goes into taking down an animal necessitates that you probably have to use the whole darn thing, right?
Yeah, and it's understood as being incredibly disrespectful to not use the whole animal, right? To be wasteful,
right,
is kind of an anathema.
And would you say so? Like, I mean, one thing that's we haven't talked about yet is like, so this is a tension. This is a battle of wills, a battle of ideologies on either side of the Bering Sea, and it doesn't sound like there were really any winners, or I mean, neither one of these ideologies won per se. It was more just like death by 1,000 cuts, or like what? Yeah, how would you describe that? How the ideological battle manifests in this region versus the traditional way in which we think about, the Cold War ideology battle.
So when I started the research for this book, I naively went in thinking that this was going to be almost entirely a story of contrasts, right? Soviets are over here doing one thing, Americans are over on the other side doing another thing. They have very different ideas of what a society should be and how an economy should be organized, and therefore, as it plays out on the ground, they're going to look really different from each other. And then I realized that they actually often looked more similar to each other than they looked different. And they ended up coming up with these sort of Arctic versions of their ideologies that more resembled each other than they resembled the kind of hardcore Marxism or free market ideas that were sort of behind their original desires to move north. And I think some of this has to do with the fact that both Soviet-style socialism and American-style capitalism understand the role of human beings and the role of a good society is one that can sort of maximally extract resources for human use from whatever ecosystem they're in. They're kind of focused first and foremost on that kind of human acquisitiveness. And, in the Soviet case, there's a kind of irony to that because it's a project that in its initial form, and it's kind of, before it takes horrible turns in the 20s and 30s and onward into the Soviet project, really has an idea of kind of a universal justice at its heart, right? It really wants to raise people up. That's what, creates this whole generation of Bolsheviks who are willing to move to the Arctic and try to convert people to this project, is that it is going to create a kind of kingdom of justice on Earth. But that kingdom of justice is really bad at seeing anything that's not a person. And within, a couple of decades actually gets really bad at seeing all kinds of people too, right? It breaks down on its goals in many ways. But that kind of blindness toward imagining a level of kind of care and comprehension for the world that's outside of sort of direct human influence, I think is actually why these two projects end up resembling each other. They're both kind of acquisitive in the same way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've again, kind of the way that I've sold this book is to my friends is like, it really challenges. I mean, I live in my own ideological bubble, like many of us do, and I try to not, but invariably I am in one to some degree. And I feel like this book really challenged my worldview, my ideological worldview in many ways, because it was like, you're the way in which you look at these tensions and the struggle between these two like larger worldviews does not fit neatly in your book. Like it's much dirtier in a more harsh and resource constrained environment. Everyone resorts to some of the stuff that they don't really want to admit they resort to on both sides of that spectrum, it sounds like to me. And I really love that about the book. And that's one of the things that I think it touches on in a way that like really it's helpful. It's really helpful to test yourself and to test your, maybe not allegiances, but your, the things that you hold dear ideologically, because this book really calls into question a lot of that. So I really appreciated that. I mean, yeah, it's really great like that. I just wanted to say there was another quote from this book that I wanted to mention, kind of getting back to the whole like carrying capacity thing, because this is a quote that stuck with me from this book, and it's on page 189. And you write that true socialist production was an escape from biology, from the cyclic constraints of birth and death. The plan would eclipse all limits on life. And I think that's like, I mean, that's in a nutshell right there, right? I mean, that's it. I mean, yeah. And so I guess a couple more things before we wrap up. One is, you know, uh, inevitably anything looking at the Arctic and tensions between these two huge countries, especially given where we are today, has to address the role that kind of climate change is going to play in all of the volatility and the uncertainty associated with this. I mean, we know that this is the next frontier, and I'm wondering you have such a deep knowledge of the history of it. How do you see, some of this stuff playing out in the next couple of years or decades with regard to climate change's impacts on the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind when I think about climate change here. And one is that the kind of dynamics of just major ecological disruption being driven by forces that are sort of politically and practically outside Beringia is not new, right? This might be the biggest instance of it and the most kind of system wide. But people living along the Bering Strait have dealt with the kind of emptying out of their oceans because of whaling and walrus hunting. That was incredibly traumatic and consequential, right? It had this caused famines and reorganizations of social life up and down the straits at the end of the 19th century. And then, if you live on the Russian side, you've actually lived through an sort of entire way of organizing society that came and went over the course of the 20th century. So in many ways, it's a place where the kind of stability that I feel like here in the kind of contiguous United States, we're starting to see fade has been absent for a while. It doesn't make it less scary, right? It doesn't make the kind of way that climate change is shifting around how you can live on the land and the seas less, just sort of less terrifying, right? It changes the patterns of the sea ice. It's eroding the shoreline away from communities on both sides. It's moving around where animals are pretty dramatically. All of that is incredibly disconcerting and eerie, and in some cases is requiring that whole communities move. So it has like incredible material consequences. But I think also people kind of articulate it as being the latest in a series of those kinds of traumas that have been brought on by this kind of energy acquisitive colonial impulse. This one just happens to really drag us everywhere else into it too.
Yeah, and are those move? I mean, it's all very well documented what's going on the U.S. side as far as communities having to be picked up and moved, or otherwise. Is that similar? Is that similarly happening on the Russian side? Are they doing something for those people? How is that playing out there?
So my knowledge of what's going on in Russia has gotten significantly worse over the last year because of the war in Ukraine. But certainly there are communities in Russia that are facing erosion in a very serious way and will need to move. And my sense is that in both places, the bureaucratic and other logistics of doing so have kind of bogged down the process, right? So there are several communities in Alaska along the northwest coast, like Kivalina and Shishmaref, that know that they have to move. They need to move in the next 5 years, and it's just a total mess of coordinating which agencies are going to pay for what and where do you want to go and what sorts of things get moved. And I think there are not dissimilar dynamics at play in Russia. There is considerably less kind of attention to indigenous decision-making power and sovereignty in Russia than there is in the US, which is not to say it's great in the US, but it's basically absent in Russia. So that also changes the dynamics, that they're not, the kind of local self-governance is considerably less on the Russian side. And my sense is that that's probably only intensified because the war has kind of required a nationalist impulse from a lot of people. Like, that's the signal you need to send, is one of being kind of unified and Russian and not different in any way. But it's actually in some ways really hard to know, because I don't have a very good sense of how people's days are going now.
Right. Yeah, I just, it's kind of it's connected to your book. I just read a book, collection of studies from some folks at Evergreen State and I think Oregon State. It was called Public Responses to Natural Gas Export. And I mentioned this book because it's as I said, a collection of studies, and one of them is set in British Columbia. And I wanted to run a quote by you and see if in in your travels up to this region, this resonated with you. In the quote, in the book, in the chapter, these folks talk about the fact that when Indigenous people in Canada hear that something is in the national interest, they know that their rights are about to be ignored or infringed upon. Canada was built on the theft of lands and resources and the near eradication of Indigenous people. Is that something that it seems to translate to the
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think generally the national interest in Alaska has correlated with the military coming in and making a bunch of decisions about where they want to build things, or pipelines being built, right? Like these kind of major infrastructural projects, or the kind of land claim settlements that come along with them. So yes, I think those often that would often hold in the Alaskan case.
Yeah, and then two more quick questions for you. One is, a lot of what we talked about is aquatic in nature, like the relationship between the water. But I'm thinking specifically about all the permafrost and the impact of climate change on permafrost and the uncertainty associated with just people moving inland, but also just the extraction of resources in this area in an environment that is underlain by very fragile, permanently, but at this point probably not for long, frozen ground. How do you see that playing out? Not just climate change's impact on ice extent, but also the permafrost in that region.
It's a good question, because it's, it is destabilizing the infrastructure basically in the circumpolar world pretty dramatically. And we saw that there was a major oil spill in sort of northern central Siberia in the summer of 2020. The Norilsk spill, and that was in part because of thawing permafrost. Permafrost is destabilizing houses in Fairbanks. Many of the houses in Fairbanks do not have a long life expectancy because they were built to kind of ride above the permafrost, but now it's thawing in places, and so their foundations are not stable. The road system is suffering all throughout the circumpolar world, where there are paved or unpaved roads because the permafrost is disappearing in some places, and that often means that it floods, or it just sort of slumps. Um, there are some wild plans right now that I heard of this summer when I was in Alaska to try to refreeze sections of permafrost that are around some of the infrastructure that supports the Trans-Alaska Pipeline,
Mm-hmm.
because the pipeline itself was engineered so that it could kind of sit on top of the permafrost, but as that base gets less stable, there's concerns about um, the pipeline sort of moving around too much.
Right.
So it's the kind of expectations of solidity that undergird a lot of Arctic construction and subarctic construction are coming undone.
Yeah. So my wife, just as a little background, my wife did her PhD at the Toolik LTER up in Alaska. Yeah. And I actually was going to go do a postdoc with her advisor, and I traveled up the Hall Road with the pipeline to our right, and then maybe I guess once we went over Adigan Pass, I think it was anyway. I don't remember where it was, but it was right next to us the whole way, and I quickly actually decided, which is why I have so much admiration for you. I quickly decided I didn't want to live up there because the mosquitoes in the summer were something I literally, yeah, my brain. The memory I have is like being in Fairbanks on my way returning back to Vermont, where we both lived, and I was sitting in a UAF dorm room with a screen and seeing these mosquitoes, and I was looking at them, swearing them up and down, like, "You will not get me. I'm leaving." And anyway, that was my memory of that. But I think that's like that also speaks to like what climate's going to be doing to the organisms that you talk so much about. Is like the mosquito upticks and the whole fragile interaction between predator prey is going to be at risk for sure. Um, and so I guess my my final question for you is, going back to the beginning of your book. You talked about you posed a question that was that you put another way. What is the nature of history when nature is part of what makes history? And you wrote that this is a question that has been your companion for many years. And I'm just wondering how you answer that question. How has your answer to that question evolved over time? Because I really like that question. I hadn't really thought about it in that way.
Yeah, I don't know if I have. I don't want to ever have a definitive answer to it in some ways, because I think it's more a method of looking at history than it is something that just has a conclusion to it.
Right.
But I think that as a way of looking at the past, it's a way of kind of understanding human capabilities and human dreams and aspirations and faults and kind of all of that stew of being a society or societies that we're trained to look at as historians, and then just sort of shifting the focus a little bit in a way that to me is kind of an act of humility, right? It's to say, okay, so we have all of these dreams and aspirations, um, and sometimes kind of terrible ideas about how the world should change. But at the end of the day, we're not the only force that gets to make the decision. Um, and what are the other forces that are part of that decision? Whether or not we acknowledge it formally, they're still there. Um, and so I see my job in some ways as just acknowledging the things that often are sidelined, like the whales or the foxes. Um, in an attempt to say, these are dynamics that are always at play. Um, if you pay attention to them, maybe we can learn something about living with them um, more fully, rather than pretending they don't exist at their expense and our own.
And kind of, I guess, from a prescriptive standpoint, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, the federal government writ large, regardless of who's running the show, what is what what do you think their role is going to be in the near future? Like, what can they learn from their mistakes and their successes, and like going forward? I mean, I'm assuming there's going to have to be a muscular role for the federal government in a hopefully humble way. But what do you see that role as being in addressing some of these issues for these people that live up there?
Yeah, I think in Alaska, and in Canada, which is now where more of my research is, in part because I don't imagine I'll be able to go back to Russia anytime in the foreseeable future, that some parts of both the federal and the state governments are really taking indigenous sovereignty more seriously, right? And there's lots and lots of work to be done on that front. Um, but for example, the Alaskan Park Service is working to redefine wilderness, right? The Park Service sort of is handed this idea of wilderness from the Wilderness Act, um, and the Wilderness Act, talks about land being, untrammeled by man and primitive, and all of these things that goes back to that idea that this is not a place where people have ever been and have no claim to and have no knowledge of living on responsibly. And they're actually trying to change that, right? To say, no, people have been living here for a long time. These are inhabited landscapes. And they're inhabited by particular people who have particular claim to it and knowledge of it. So I think that there are kind of cracks opening where the voices that are articulating what a good life is and what the future looks like is expanding, and that to me is the hopeful part of of a story that sometimes can feel not particularly hopeful, because I think it's a place both from sort of a justice perspective and from an extremely practical perspective of how are we going to figure out as a society how to live in rapidly changing times. There's a lot to be learned.
Thank you. Yeah, and then finally, I'm just wondering, like, what is your next up on your agenda for your research in this in this region of the world? You talked a lot about Canada. What are you doing there?
So I'm working on an environmental history of the Yukon River watershed, which is an enormous amount of fun. I spent last year in archives, but also boating parts of the river and mushing parts of it with dog teams. And then this summer, I'm going back to do more of the river by boat, just to kind of connect the present with the past. And part of what interests me about the Yukon is actually exactly these kinds of questions of who has sovereignty and whose ideas of law end up shaping the relationship between people and their environments. Because there are many different indigenous cultures along the watershed, and the Russian and British empires meet on the watershed in the 19th century, and then the US and Canada split it in the 20th century, alongside these kind of continuing indigenous forms of governance and attempts to kind of reclaim sovereignty from nation states. And within that, there are all sorts of different stories about how it is that people kind of use legal procedures and ideas to make decisions about how to live well in the places that they inhabit, and struggles over it. To me, it's the place in my kind of ongoing quest to understand the relationship between like the ideas that we have and the material world we live in, that law is the place where those two things often really meet up, because people have their ideals in law and then they have like whatever is happening on the ground and have to try to reconcile them. And then if you have different legal cultures meeting, there's even more kind of variables in that mix. So that's what I'm in the middle of right now. I have no takeaways or conclusions at the moment at all, because I'm really in the high grasses, but it's a lot of fun.
Are you going back up there for like another field season or something, or what's the deal there?
Yeah, I was on sabbatical last year, so I was up there for most of 2022, and then I'll be back up basically as soon as I'm done teaching this spring, for the summer.
Oh, that sounds really fun. Really fun. Stay away from mosquitoes. You wear a net around your face?
Yeah, it's so bad. Last year on the Yukon, it was out of control. I actually went up to Toolik, and Toolik was a break from how bad they had been.
Oh, really? Yeah, I was so impressed with like, my wife's running joke though is like they would go out into some of their field sites and they would be there for a week. And this one guy she worked with, who was a Mormon from Utah, he would pack these huge things full of candy because he didn't eat anything other than candy. And I said, well, that's National Science Foundation money going to good use, right? So, well, I appreciate you doing this with us, and I really look forward to your talk to FACT. It's really exciting, and I hope that I'm sure it's going to resonate with everyone. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. You can learn more about FACT on our website, fact.org. We have a link in our show notes. And you can purchase a copy of Dr. Demuth's book, Floating Coast, An Environmental History of the Bering Strait, at Amazon. There's also a link in our show notes. Until next time.